Frank Carter liked his mornings quiet, his coffee hot, and his generator humming like a good soldier. The low rumble behind the barn had become as much a part of Frank's life as the ticking of the old brass clock in the kitchen. It wasn't just a piece of equipment, it was a promise, a continuation of something he'd started decades ago in uniform. Now, in retirement, he kept that promise alive beneath the corrugated metal roof of a shed that most neighbors barely noticed. Most, but not all. A thin veil of mist still clung to the fields as Frank pulled on his old canvas jacket and stepped into the cool of an Arkansas October morning. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and the last mow of the season. Fallen leaves stuck to his boots as he walked the familiar path toward the shed. Inside, the generator greeted him with its usual hum, steady and sure, like a disciplined recruit awaiting orders. He ran his hand along the side of the green casing, fingers brushing the stenciled lettering that read, "Property of U.S. Government." The paint was chipped, but the message was still clear. Kneeling beside the unit, Frank opened the panel and checked the readings, making careful notes in his worn ledger before booting up the tablet Linda had finally convinced him to use. With a few taps, the diagnostics were on their way to Captain Briggs at the guard station, just like every week. Linda called from the porch, her voice soft but firm. "You'd better get moving if you want to beat the morning crowd." "I'm going. Don't let the diner run out of bacon without me," he replied, brushing off his sleeves and setting out down the gravel drive. Darla's Diner sat at the corner of Main and Pine, nestled between a feed store and a shuttered barber shop. Inside, the scent of black coffee, sizzling bacon, and pine-scented floor cleaner clung to the wooden booths and scuffed linoleum like familiar ghosts. Country tunes from the 1960s crackled softly through a speaker behind the counter. Earl Dixon waved him over with a half-raised mug. "You're late. I already heard about your generator." Frank slid into the booth, adjusting his cap. "Heard what exactly?" Earl sipped his coffee before answering. "Geraldine Harper's been talking about that thing again. Says it's an eyesore. Claims it messes with the visual harmony of the community." Frank raised an eyebrow. "It's not even in their jurisdiction." Earl shrugged. "You know how these HOA types are. They see a patch of paint they didn't choose, and they start twitching." Frank smirked, but the thought lingered. Geraldine Harper had only been HOA president for 6 months, but she had a reputation for trying to reshape the neighborhood into something closer to her suburban Connecticut roots. This wasn't Connecticut. This was Maple Hollow, and it had its own way of doing things. He stayed for one refill and a quiet laugh with Earl, then headed home. Linda was out at her quilting circle by then, leaving behind the scent of cinnamon rolls and fresh fabric. The circle met every Wednesday in the basement of First Baptist, and if gossip had a heartbeat in this town, it pulsed from there. By the time Frank returned to the house, the mist had lifted and the sun cast long slants across the front yard. Something white was sticking out of the mailbox. He pulled it out carefully, a folded sheet inside a plastic sleeve. No stamp, no return address. Just his name and HOA Visual Disruption Notice typed in bold at the top. Frank unfolded the page slowly, eyes scanning the contents. There was mention of unpermitted auxiliary structures, ambient community standards, and equipment not conforming to regional aesthetic expectations. Somewhere in the middle, the tone shifted from passive to vaguely threatening. If the equipment in question, clearly his generator, was not removed or relocated within 7 calendar days, the HOA may exercise impoundment action as defined under local ordinances. His hands didn't tremble, but they did still as he finished reading. He stepped into his workshop, a converted horse barn with old tool racks, a worn workbench, and a faded photo of himself and his signal unit pinned to the cork wall. He pulled open the wide bottom drawer of the file cabinet and took out a thick folder. Inside was a laminated maintenance agreement marked with an embossed seal, Department of Defense, Emergency Infrastructure Support. Below it, in bold, assigned to civilian operator, retired, Officer Frank Carter. Unauthorized tampering strictly prohibited. Frank calmly tore open a drawer and laid the notice beside a government-issued maintenance agreement bearing a Department of Defense seal. In Maple Hollow, trouble didn't knock. It came in the form of glossy memos and enforced harmony. Frank Carter stood near the back wall of the HOA clubhouse, arms crossed, watching as residents trickled in and took their seats. The room was filled with fold-out chairs and the scent of lemon floor polish, and at the front stood Geraldine Harper in a pale gray pantsuit, her hair pulled tight and her smile tighter. A large screen behind her displayed the title of tonight's presentation in gold serif font: Willow Estates Vision Session, Enhancing Our Shared Spaces. Frank hadn't planned to attend, but curiosity, or maybe something closer to forewarning, had brought him in. He didn't have to be under HOA jurisdiction to know when someone was drawing a line. Geraldine tapped her tablet, and the first slide filled the screen with photos of hedges, trimmed evenly like military haircuts, and driveways free of so much as a stray pebble. "It's time," she said, voice syrupy, "to embrace ambient zone oversight. We all want to live in a place that soothes the eye, fosters unity, and maintains strong property values." There were nods, mostly from the newer homeowners who didn't know the town before the gates and signs went up. Then came the next image, a wide shot of Frank's barn in the distance, just visible from the main road, with the top of the green generator peeking from behind a tool shed. The photo was slightly tilted, as if taken in haste. "This," Geraldine continued, "is what we're working to gently correct. Visual interruptions to our community aesthetic. Our perimeter matters just as much as our cul-de-sacs." Frank stepped forward a few paces, not enough to make a scene, but just close enough that several heads turned. Geraldine glanced his way, and for the briefest second, the smile dropped. It was enough. He'd seen that face before. Officers behind desks pretending to care while pushing paper that sent good men to worse places. After the meeting ended, Frank didn't approach her. He knew better than to start something in front of an audience. Instead, he went home, pulled out the deed, the zoning paperwork, and the federal agreement, and put them all in a manila envelope. The next morning, he drove back to the clubhouse and handed the packet to the receptionist, asking politely that it be passed along to Mrs. Harper. The young woman behind the desk looked unsure, but nodded anyway. That afternoon, no one came to call, no phone rang, no reply came. But when Frank opened his mailbox, there was a fresh envelope bearing the HOA's golden seal. Inside, a second notice, now printed in red. The language had shifted. Final warning. Nuisance equipment. Frank sat on the porch and read it twice. Linda joined him, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Same woman," she said. "Same tone I heard back in quilting this morning. Some of the ladies said she's been driving by our place, not just once." He looked out toward the barn, jaw tightening. "You think she's been taking pictures?" Linda hesitated, then nodded. "Janet said she saw Geraldine parked on the shoulder yesterday. Didn't think much of it at the time." Frank stood, the chair creaking under his weight. Time to light up the place a bit. That evening, while Linda stirred a pot of chili inside, Frank installed 2 new motion-activated lights on the corners of the barn and another above the generator shed. The wiring was simple. He'd done more complex setups in worse places with fewer tools. At 7:15, he locked up the barn and drove into town to meet Sheriff Halloran at the Veterans Hall. The old building smelled like linoleum and old coffee, the walls lined with plaques and faded photos. They sat across from each other over chipped ceramic plates of meatloaf and green beans. "She's coming after the generator," Frank said plainly. The sheriff nodded, chewing slowly. "Heard about the notice. Saw it myself. One of her board members showed it to me like it was gospel." "She's pushing boundaries." "She always does," Halloran said, picking up his water. "Tried finding the Millers last spring. Said their bird feeders violated seed dispersion guidelines. I didn't even know that was a thing." Frank let out a dry chuckle, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You want me to step in?" the sheriff asked. "Not yet," Frank replied. "Let's see how deep she wants to dig this hole." When he got back home, the yard was still, the porch light casting a soft glow across the gravel. Linda was on the couch, flipping through a quilting magazine, but her eyes lifted when she saw him. "Tommy stopped by," she said. "He left something for you." Frank found the note on the kitchen table, written in Tommy's all-caps scrawl. "Frank saw something you might want to see. Photos blurry, but look close." Attached was a small printout, fuzzy and grainy, but unmistakable, the shape of a white Escalade, parked just past the Carter's fence line. Tommy Ray shows Frank a blurry photo he took of Geraldine's white Escalade parked just past the Carter's fence line. On October 29th, Maple Hollow went dark, not because of the weather, but because someone wanted to prove a point. Earlier that afternoon, the sky over the little town had been soft with clouds, the kind that rolled in like sheep across the hills, but held no real menace. Frank and Linda had packed an overnight bag and loaded into the truck for a quick trip to Little Rock. Their granddaughter had just turned 8, and Linda insisted they hand-deliver the birthday quilt she'd spent weeks stitching. "Nothing ever happens here," the girl had said with a grin, hugging her grandparents tightly. That phrase would echo for days. Back in Maple Hollow, the night settled heavy. Tommy Ray stood outside his garage, the hood of a rusted '93 Chevy propped open, hands black with grease. He wiped them on a shop rag and looked toward the ridge where the Carter property sat. The lights were still on, barely visible, but always steady. Until they weren't. At precisely 11:48 p.m., the ridge dimmed. A moment later, the distant hum of diesel pierced the quiet. Tommy turned his head, squinting through the trees. He caught a flicker of moving lights, headlamps angled wrong for regular road traffic. Grabbing his phone, he jogged across the gravel toward the edge of his property where it backed up against Frank's. Through the brush and the swaying branches, he saw it. A flatbed tow truck slowly backing into the Carter's access road, its lights dimmed, the driver jumping out to unhook the gate chain. Behind the truck, Rick Dunning stood with a clipboard in one hand and a folded sign in the other. Tommy recognized him immediately. Geraldine's nephew, self-appointed enforcer of HOA standards. Rick wore dark jeans and a Willow Estates windbreaker, collar pulled up like he was doing something more official than shady. Tommy crouched low and hit record. The camera phone jittered in the dark, but it caught the outline of the green generator, the hydraulic winch lowering to meet it, and the low murmur of conversation. The driver hesitated, gesturing toward something on the equipment. "It's all signed for," Rick insisted. "We got HOA authorization. It was left in violation of noise and aesthetics rules. This is compliance." The driver didn't look convinced, but he started the process. Chains clinked, metal shifted, the generator creaked as it was hoisted, tilted, then settled on the flatbed with a thud. Tommy ducked lower as Rick hammered a stake into the dirt. He unfurled the sign and planted it in the ground next to the now empty pad. Noise violation. Equipment removed per HOA action. As the truck rolled away, red taillights disappearing down the road, Tommy hit send. The video went straight to Frank's number, followed by a brief text. "You need to see this. Generator gone. Rick was here." In Little Rock, Frank and Linda had just returned to the guest room. Linda was brushing her hair, humming softly. Frank checked his phone out of habit and paused when the video began to load. He didn't speak, just handed it to Linda, her hand slowly falling to her side as she watched. The final frame, the empty shed pad, lingered on screen. The return trip was quiet. They left before sunrise, neither saying much. The winding roads back to Maple Hollow looked the same as always, but Frank felt the shift before they even turned into their drive. Linda stepped out first. Her eyes scanned the ground. "There are tire tracks," she said, walking forward. "And the fence, look." One of the wooden posts had been cracked clean through, splinters fanned like an open wound. Frank didn't answer. He walked straight toward the shed, his boots crunching over the gravel in a rhythm that grew sharper with every step. The door swung open with a creak that sounded louder than usual in the still morning air. Inside, the shed was hollow. The space that had once been filled with mechanical rhythm now sat in a heavy silence. Tools on the wall, the oil pan, even the half-full mug he'd left behind. What remained was a sign hammered into the wall by a single bent nail. Violation closed. Frank stood still for a moment, then turned. He walked across the property, past the barn, toward his workshop. Inside, the light from the east window cut a golden line across the workbench. He moved with precision, no panic, no rush, and stopped at a tall metal cabinet in the back. The combination took only a second. He opened the drawer, reached inside, and pulled out a thick manila folder, the front marked clearly in red. Confidential. Federal use. Authorization. Frank Carter had seen storms in the desert, chaos in the jungle, and bureaucrats in suits, but nothing prepared him for a tow truck in Arkansas. The metal folder weighed more in his hand than its contents should have allowed. He set it on the workbench beside a well-worn tape measure and a mug still half full of yesterday's coffee. Linda stood at the doorway, arms folded, lips pressed tight. "Call them," she said. He didn't argue. Frank reached for the rotary phone mounted on the wall next to the fuse box. The number was scrawled in ink on the inside of the folder. It hadn't changed in years. He dialed slowly. Each click of the rotary wheel echoed in the silent barn. A voice answered on the third ring. "Operations." "This is Frank Carter," he said. "Retired Signal Corps. I have a situation involving an assigned asset, the generator. It's gone." There was a pause. Then a second voice, more senior, came on the line. "This is Captain Lane Briggs. I'm familiar with your case, Mr. Carter. Explain." Frank relayed everything, from the original HOA warnings to the security footage Tommy had taken. Briggs asked for nothing but facts, no interruptions. When Frank mentioned the laminated maintenance agreement, the captain simply said, "Scan and send." "I'll be there within the next 4 hours." By noon, Sheriff Halloran had arrived with a thermos of coffee and a yellow legal pad. "She moved too fast," Halloran muttered after seeing the impound sign. "Didn't run this through any local authority. I checked. No paperwork filed with the county." "She thought it was abandoned," Frank said, not bothering to hide the edge in his voice. "Even though it's behind a fence, on private land, with federal markings," Halloran gave a short nod. "I'll stay close. When they show, let me know." At 1:17 p.m., a black SUV turned onto the gravel road, followed by a white sedan with government plates. The vehicles came to a smooth stop near the barn. Captain Lane Briggs stepped out first, tall, clean-cut, his expression unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. "Mr. Carter," he said, shaking Frank's hand firmly. "Let's get to work." Inside the workshop, Frank laid out the folder, the deed to the land, the zoning maps, and Tommy's printed photos. Briggs examined everything with the precision of a man who'd filed more reports than he'd eaten hot meals. "The generator is part of our Emergency Infrastructure Support Initiative," Briggs confirmed. "Its removal interferes with a FEMA communication node in this region. That makes this not only unauthorized, it's a federal disruption." Linda poured coffee without a word. The captain nodded gratefully but didn't sip. Briggs tapped his radio. "Patch me through to legal." Within minutes, a laptop was set up on the bench. Lieutenant Joanna Miles from the JAG Corps appeared on a video call. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, her eyes scanning the documents Frank held up to the camera. "We're classifying this as an unauthorized seizure of federal property. You're entitled to full cooperation." Frank gave a slow nod. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He'd seen too many operations go sideways to celebrate early. Outside, Halloran spoke quietly on his cell phone, coordinating with dispatch in case a local towing company needed to be held accountable. Briggs drafted an immediate recovery order. Lieutenant Miles requested a physical site review. An hour later, Briggs and Halloran walked the perimeter with Frank, noting where the generator had stood. Briggs pointed to a patch of gravel with fresh tread marks. "Tow truck came through here. No protective matting, no flag notice. This is going to be a mess for them." Frank remained quiet, but Linda wasn't done. Back at the porch, she bent down to pick up something tucked beneath the welcome mat. A sealed HOA envelope. She opened it, revealing a single page, typed and unsigned, with a scribbled note at the bottom. "We thought it was abandoned." The National Guard didn't roll in with tanks, just paperwork, uniforms, and enough silence to make a Cadillac tremble. It began with the crunch of tires on gravel. A small convoy rolled down the Carter driveway, an olive-green transport vehicle followed by 2 black SUVs and a state-licensed utility escort. The morning sun reflected off windshields, casting bright flares across the golden fields. Captain Briggs stepped out first, flanked by 2 uniformed personnel who moved briskly but without aggression. Behind them, secured to the bed of the flatbed trailer, was the generator. Its green casing looked no worse for wear, though a few minor scratches and scuffs hinted at its unwanted journey. One soldier snapped photographs as the equipment was lowered back into position behind Frank's barn. Another confirmed the GPS coordinates matched the original logs. Reporters from the local paper had already gathered at the fence, tipped off by an anonymous call. One camera shutter clicked as Captain Briggs calmly pointed out the military stenciling still intact on the generator's side. "Property of U.S. government, do not tamper." Linda stood quietly on the porch, arms folded, watching the precision of the return like it was a scene from an old newsreel. Frank stood beside her, boots planted, nodding once as the winch clicked into place. Then came the white Escalade, tires skimming the edge of the Carter's grass, coming to a sharp halt in a cloud of road dust. Geraldine Harper stepped out, her navy blazer buttoned too tightly, a clipboard clutched like a shield. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, striding toward the trailer. "That equipment was removed under legal HOA action. You can't just—" "You'll want to speak with Lieutenant Joanna Miles," Frank said, his voice steady. "She's the one holding the cease and desist." Lieutenant Miles appeared at Geraldine's side as if conjured. Dressed in full-service uniform, she handed over a sealed envelope. "Ms. Harper, per Article 41 of the Federal Property Management Code, your actions have triggered multiple jurisdictional violations. This notice includes the details." "I don't understand," Geraldine snapped, scanning the document. "This was abandoned equipment. The board voted—" "Actually," Sheriff Halloran interrupted, stepping forward with a second envelope, "no such vote was recorded. And your own treasurer confirmed yesterday that the impound fee was paid with HOA funds, unauthorized." Briggs added, "We've reviewed the site survey, security footage, and the equipment's classification. This generator is part of the Emergency Infrastructure Support Initiative. It was never abandoned. It was federal property on private land." Geraldine opened her mouth again, then closed it. For the first time, her eyes flicked downward. She turned, muttering something about calling her attorney, but no one followed. That evening, the community clubhouse overflowed. Folding chairs lined the walls, and even the hallway held clusters of residents, murmuring quietly. A whiteboard at the front read, "Emergency HOA Session Open to All." Tommy Ray stood near the front, a laptop plugged into the mounted TV. When his name was called, he played the video he'd recorded, the flatbed under cover of night, Rick Dunning's voice insisting it was all signed for, and the generator being hauled away. There was silence when the clip ended. Then Doris Llewellyn rose from her seat. "I've lived here 22 years. I've seen a lot of rules, but none that allowed someone to lie, spend our money, and try to bury it." Applause rippled through the room. The HOA treasurer stood reluctantly next. The $1,200 towing fee and $300 in legal processing were logged under Community Aesthetics Improvement. No proposal was ever submitted, no vote taken. Murmurs turned to raised voices. Residents began sharing their own stories, petty fines, threats for wind chimes, violations for mailbox colors. A man in the back said he'd been threatened with a lien over a rain barrel. A woman whispered that Geraldine had told her to remove her husband's military flag because it clashed with the color scheme. Finally, the secretary walked to the front with a single sheet of paper. This was delivered an hour before the meeting. She cleared her throat. "Effective immediately, I resign from the Willow Estates Homeowners Association. I will be relocating out of the community due to personal health reasons. Geraldine Harper." There was a pause, then spontaneous applause. Not wild, not cruel, just relieved. Judge Carl Stanton, retired, rose from the back. "I suggest we hold an immediate vote for interim leadership." The generator hummed again, but now it wasn't just powering cables, it was powering trust. 3 days had passed since the resignation. The shed behind Frank's barn looked much the same as before, though now the green generator stood behind reinforced fencing, freshly cleaned and marked with a bold stencil. "Federal asset, do not tamper." The hum it gave off was the same old tone, low, steady, unyielding, but it seemed to carry a different kind of weight now. Frank adjusted a support bracket, stepped back, and nodded. Satisfied. Linda appeared behind him, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You know," she said, offering him one, "that sounds not just power, it's peace of mind." Frank took the cup with a quiet smile. "Let's hope it lasts." By late afternoon, the final touches were being laid for the Maple Hollow Harvest Fair. Tables lined the community green, covered in red and white gingham cloths. Hand-lettered signs pointed toward hayrides, pie contests, and the quilting exhibit. Linda's circle had worked overtime to finish their displays, including a group piece called Patchwork of Peace, stitched with local landmarks and family names. Children raced through fallen leaves, faces sticky with candied apples. A local bluegrass trio tuned their instruments near the pavilion, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke and cider. Frank, dressed in his cleanest flannel and pressed jeans, didn't expect to be called up. But midway through the fair, as the sun dipped behind the trees and lights flickered on above the booths, Judge Stanton stepped to the microphone. "This community stood at a crossroads," he said, "and we found our footing thanks to neighbors who didn't just complain. They stood firm. One of them never asked for thanks, but tonight we'd like to offer it." Tommy Ray handed Frank a wooden plaque. Its inscription was simple. "In recognition of duty beyond the uniform, Maple Hollow 2023. Frank cleared his throat, stepped to the mic, and adjusted his cap. Power doesn't come from machines. It comes from people who stand their ground. The crowd applauded, not with roaring cheers, but with warmth, a shared gratitude, the kind that makes a place feel like home again. Later that evening, the new HOA charter was read aloud at the clubhouse. Amendments passed unanimously. All major decisions now required community votes. Fines and enforcement actions would need documented board approval. No more surprise notices. No more quiet impoundments. Doris Llewellyn was named interim president. Her first motion was to create a transparency board. Her second, let's never forget how fast things can go wrong when we stop talking to each other. As the fair wound down, Captain Briggs approached Frank near the bandstand. "There's a new state-level resilience program in development," he said, voice low. "Emergency prep, community response teams. You'd make a fine advisor." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Thought I was retired." "You're too useful for that," Briggs said with a half-smile. "Besides, we could use more people who know how to get things done without yelling." Linda found Frank just as the school band played a slow, familiar, patriotic tune. They joined the small crowd under the string lights, and without a word, he took her hand. They swayed gently to the music, surrounded by children laughing, neighbors chatting, and a town quietly healing. Behind them, the generator hummed on. And somewhere beyond the fairgrounds, Tommy Ray held a folder marked Youth Preparedness Program and looked toward the stars. Briggs leaned over. "Frank, we've got a state-level resilience program forming. You'd make a fine advisor." Here is the closing segment for the story, following prompt 6 exactly. The lights of Maple Hollow's Harvest Fair may have faded, but something stronger remained, respect, restored not by force, but by quiet resolve. What began as one man protecting a machine became a town reclaiming its voice. Sometimes the strongest power doesn't come from wires or engines. It comes from neighbors who remember what it means to stand together. Because in a place where fences once divided, now the fields carry more than crops. They carry trust.